Cool, yeah, so I'm going to be talking about something a little bit different, not directly related to remote sensing. I'm going to talk about a project that I was able to work on earlier this year, creating an animated time lapse of the aerial firefighting operations over the Palisades Fire in Los Angeles. Just as a little bit of background, I moved to Southern California in the summer of 2024, which turned out to be a bit of a strange time to move to Southern California. It was the start of one of the most active and destructive wildfire seasons in the region's history. We had a major fire close to where we were in San Bernardino County with the line fire, and then throughout the area, and then, of course, the incredibly destructive fires in the Pacific Palisades and Altadena communities in the Los Angeles area. Some pictures that I took of the line fire just north of Redlands. And one of the things that I noticed as this was going on was the amount of aerial activity happening around San Bernardino. This was because San Bernardino International Airport was one of the major staging areas for these firefighting aircraft. I had wanted to find a story to tell about this wildfire season and a way to visualize it that I hadn't seen visualized before, and focusing on the aerial response seemed like a perfect angle to take. It also seemed like a good opportunity to sort of develop a better approach and some best practices for doing 3D animations of time series data, so I think that's what I'm going to touch on a little bit in this presentation. For the data that we used for this project, we were lucky enough to be able to partner with FlightAware, a flight tracking service, through a partnership that they've developed with Esri over the last year. For other projects that I've done this year, mapping flight tracking data, I found there are a couple of other sources that work pretty well. FlightRadar has an API that you can query relatively inexpensively, although I find the documentation is a little bit lacking. And then there's a crowdsourced free alternative called adsb.lol that works very well, although I find their coverage is a lot more variable than the paid options. The data that we were getting was point transponder data from the aircraft. So it's a signal that aircraft are sending that says, this is where I am, this is who I am. The data contains their position and airspeed and identifying number, and then these services will enrich it with some additional data like what type of aircraft it is and airport of origin and destination. So we had a bounding box around the Palisades Fire that went up to about 14,000 feet because we wanted to try to cut off any commercial traffic that was happening in the same area. And then we wanted to get the full flight traces of any flights that entered that bounding box because I wasn't sure if I was just going to map the area around the fire or if I wanted to be able to trace it back to the airports that they were being deployed from. And when we ran the query, this is what we got, which looks really cool, but isn't what we were looking for. It turned out that our bounding box intersected with the approach to LAX, so we got about a day's worth of commercial traffic, which is kind of neat. I feel like there's another project in there somewhere. But I ended up just doing a bit of manual querying. There are also a lot of news helicopters, the ubiquitous LAPD helicopters that ended up intersecting it. I used FlightRadar to filter it down, looking at some airports in the area and looking at their arrival and departure logs for those days, and then looking up the tail numbers of the aircraft. Most of the time, FlightRadar had that data in their database, but for some aircraft, I would just look up the tail numbers with the FAA's database to get the owner and then be able to identify if it was involved in firefighting operations on the day that we were looking at. Ultimately from that, we came up with a list of 45 aircraft that were working on January 9th, 2025, which was the first day of the full-scale aerial response in the Palisades. So this represented there were 20 different types of aircraft working, and they were being operated at the same time by 17 different agencies, so ranging from local, state, county level, as well as private contractors and international groups like the government of Quebec. And just to digress very briefly, it's a really interesting collection of vehicles. The yellow one, the Canadair CL415, is about the only one that's purpose designed and built as a firefighting aircraft. Almost all the others are originally military or utility or passenger aircraft that got repurposed for this very specialized role. And then having done that and filtered it down just to those 45 aircraft, we were able to see their flight paths on the day in question. We were able to see that there were about 8 airports in the region that were deploying them. The busiest was Van Nuys, just a few miles north of the fire. That was where most of the helicopters were being deployed from. And so with that in mind, we were able to start defining like the scope of what we actually wanted to animate. For the location, I decided I wanted to zoom in and look at just the area over the fire to be able to see the coordination of the aircraft as they were dropping water and retardant on the fire. And because this is an animation, in addition to having a spatial scale, the map is also going to have a temporal scale. So just as the scale of a map is the ratio between the distance that an object appears on the map and the distance that it appears, the distance that it takes up in the real world, our temporal scale is going to be a ratio of how long an event takes in our animation to how long that event actually took in real life. And just like with our spatial scale, and I want to make sure I'm getting this right, as the scale gets smaller, details get more and more compressed, so like a polygon gets generalized down to a point. The same is going to be true with time. So as we compress the time more and more, events are going to become briefer and briefer until they appear instantaneous. So if we want to show something having a duration, like a flight, we want to make sure that we aren't compressing it so that it just happens in the blink of an eye, and that's why I decided I wanted to just focus on a single day rather than showing like the entire week of the response to the fire. I find for animating time series data, a good length to keep people's attention is 1 to 2 minutes. So if our animation is going to be 2 minutes long and we're showing 1 day of data, that's going to ultimately leave us with a time scale of 1 to 720, so it means our animation is going to play back at 720 times real time, or 1 second of our animation is going to represent 12 minutes of real time. The animation was done in Blender using geometry nodes after the data was processed in ArcGIS Pro. For the base map, I basically followed like the general like Blender workflow for doing like 3D terrain. The only thing that was different is because this is for animation, I needed to put more consideration into optimizing for render time because we're not just rendering a single still, we're going to be rendering thousands of frames. So not creating any geometry I don't need, and not using bigger image textures than I need. If I'm going to be exporting at 1080p, I don't need a 4K image for my imagery. And then how the animation worked, we brought in the point data into Blender, then filtered it based on the timestamp, so the points would appear, persist for a certain amount of time, then disappear. We joined them to a line based on the aircraft's ID number, so each aircraft gets a unique line. And then finally, applying a shader that was color-coded based on the role the aircraft was taking. Was it a helicopter? Was it an aerial tanker? Was it mapping? Was it providing like support? And just to briefly talk about the shader I used, I find for animating the movement of points, this sort of like firefly line works really well, where you have a bright spark at the front that shows the position of the object at the moment of time, and the length of the spark in this case was determined by the airspeed of the aircraft. So you get like instantaneous motion and speed, and then it leaves a long trail that slowly fades over several seconds and has time to sort of build up, so you start to see the pattern and the structure of the flight. So you can see the difference between a helicopter making a bunch of quick zigzagging passes and a larger fixed-wing aircraft flying in. For lighting the scene, the one thing I did for that was I animated the elevation and color temperature of the light source to kind of give an effect of a change in the time of day, since we were animating a 24-hour period. And this is what that looked like. I think found it was, and not showing like a realistic movement of the sun, but more just to kind of like generally like give that effect. For positioning the camera, this is like the most useful thing that I learned in terms of doing any sort of 3D visualization, is that in most 3D software, the camera is going to default to having its pivot point be the camera itself. So it works like the camera's on a tripod. As you rotate the camera, it's rotating like from the camera. But it works way better if you can rig the camera up to act like a selfie stick, where like it pivots on the subject. So when you rotate the camera, it's going to move in like a nice arc around the subject. It's always going to keep the center of your map framed up. So I found that worked really well. I had it orbit the subject in about a 120-degree arc. I like to keep it under 180 degrees, so you're always on the same side of the subject, and it makes it less disorienting. And this is what that looked like. I also had some of the labels lock their rotation to the camera so that they always stayed like right side up. And then to render the final animation, I used Blender's real-time Eevee render engine. Because of the optimization I was able to do, like creating the model, I was able to render the 3,600 frames in under 2 hours on a mid-range 5-year-old workstation, which worked pretty well. And this is a quick clip of how the final animation turned out. I really like how you can see like the different like patterns and structure of the response and the sort of coordination that went into having all these different vehicles flying different patterns with different, operated by different people, work together to respond to the fire. A couple of the details that kind of popped out to me like going through it. It's interesting to see the flying boat fly this sort of figure 8 pattern, how it's able to make like dozens of drops, picking up water off of Santa Monica, rather than having to fly back to its staging base every time. And then for the larger tankers, working in tandem with a spotter aircraft in green, where the tanker in red flies in, forms up with the spotter, and then makes its drop. And then the last thing I really love about a project like this is that at the end of it, I haven't just made a map, I've made a new tool and a new tech stack that I can reuse with other data. So I was able to reuse this approach this summer. We got to work on a project mapping a parasailing race that was done through the Alps over the summer. So I was able to use the same visualization technique to show these parasailers, and I found it really interesting to see like a completely different pattern emerge, and a completely different sort of behavior from this like very different type of aircraft. Really interesting to see them like finding like thermals and updrafts as they moved. Yeah, so that's what I've got for you today. I'm going to share I'll share a link in Slack to the finished animations, and I'm hoping to get some like documentation and sample files written up for this approach as well. So yeah, thank you very much.
We could do one question for Peter while we move on. If anyone has one question. Question in the back.
I apologize if I missed this part, but do you have a sense of how many hours went into producing the Palisades map?
How many hours went into producing it? I always find like if it's something like this where I'm starting like a new approach, it takes a little bit longer because it's testing the tool. I think this was probably like, it was over the course, like an hour here and there over the course of a couple of weeks. And like now that I've got sort of the system set up, I can do something similar in probably like 2 or 3 days.
Great. Thank you, Peter.